The ghost in the machine of Jake Carter's life was made of dust and memory. It coated the splintered floorboards of the farmhouse, clung to the rust-eaten shell of his father's Ford F-150, and settled in the hollows of his own scarred face. He was a curator of decay, the sole resident of a museum dedicated to things that had died: the farm, his family, his career as a Marine raider, all exhibits in a gallery of failure. He stood on the porch, a silhouette against the bruised purple of a November dusk. The wind was a physical presence, a bully that shoved and bit at his worn jacket. It carried the scent of wet earth and coming snow. Below, the valley was a patchwork of browns and dead yellows, a landscape that mirrored the terrain of his soul. He had come home to this place in western Pennsylvania, to disappear, to let the silence and the rot consume what was left of him after the blast in Helmand Province had taken everything else. His team was gone, vaporized. Mac with his stupid jokes. Reyes, who was teaching himself to play guitar on a beat-up acoustic. Lieutenant Miller, who had a baby girl he'd never met. They were just names on a wall now, ghosts that walked with him in the daylight and screamed his name in the dark. He'd been the lucky one, they'd told him. Thrown clear. Lucky meant a shattered femur, a spiderweb of scars across his back and neck, and a medical discharge that felt like a brand of shame. It meant surviving to carry the weight of all those who did not. The farmhouse groaned around him, its old bones settling. It was a sound he knew well, the sigh of something surrendering to gravity and time. He felt a kinship with the structure. Both of them were gutted, hollowed out, waiting for the final collapse. He ran a hand over the rough-hewn porch rail, his calloused fingers tracing the deep grooves in the wood. The world had become a thing of textures and faint sounds, a low-fidelity broadcast he could barely tune in. The vibrant colors, the rich symphony of a life fully lived, had been dialed down to a monochrome hum. He closed his eyes, and the scent of the wind was replaced by the smell of Afghanistan. Acrid smoke, hot metal, the coppery tang of blood. He could feel the sun beating down, the weight of his plate carrier, the familiar grip of his rifle. He could hear the crackle of the radio, then the whistle, then the world-ending roar. His breath hitched, a dry, ragged sound in his throat. The ghosts were getting louder today. A single headlight cut through the gloaming, navigating the rutted dirt track that served as his driveway. It was a rare sight. Visitors were not part of his carefully curated isolation. He watched the vehicle, a sensible sedan utterly out of place in this wilderness of neglect, bounce and shudder its way toward the house. His body, a machine he no longer felt he commanded, went on alert. His posture straightened, his gaze sharpened, tracking the car's movement with a predator's focus. The instincts of the raider were buried deep, but they were not dead. The car stopped. A man in a suit, looking profoundly uncomfortable, stepped out. He clutched a briefcase to his chest like a shield. Jake didn't move. He let the silence stretch. Another tool from a life he was supposed to have left behind. Let the visitor feel the isolation. Let him feel the eyes on him from the shadows of the porch. The man cleared his throat, his voice thin against the vastness of the dying day. "Mr. Jacob Carter?" Jake said nothing. He was a statue carved from grief and suspicion. "My name is Arthur Finch. I'm an attorney." The man continued, taking a hesitant step forward. "I'm the executor of the estate of Mr. Elias Abernathy." The name registered, a small stone dropped into the deep well of Jake's indifference. Abernathy, the old man from the next ridge over. A World War II veteran, they said, lived even more reclusively than Jake did. They'd never spoken, only exchanged a single, solemn nod once when their trucks passed on the county road. "He passed away 2 days ago," Finch said, his tone professionally somber. Peacefully, he was 98. Jake remained silent, a sentinel guarding a tomb. He had no connection to this man. This had nothing to do with him. Finch seemed to gather his courage. He took another step. Mr. Abernathy's will was unconventional. He had no living family to speak of. His instructions were very specific, especially regarding his dog. The lawyer paused, looking up at Jake's impassive face. He left one, very clear instruction. He wrote it himself. The lawyer opened his briefcase and pulled out a single folded sheet of paper. He held it up as if it were a verdict. "It says, 'Give my dog to the Marine. He'll know what to do.'" Finch lowered the paper. "You're the only Marine for 10 miles in any direction, Mr. Carter. The only one who fits the profile Elias described. The instruction is for you." Jake's world, which had been a fixed point of gray, shifted. A dog. A responsibility. A tether to the world he had been so determined to sever. He felt a flicker of something that might have been anger, or maybe it was just the first tremor of an earthquake deep inside him. "I don't want a dog," he said, his voice a low gravelly thing, rusted from disuse. "I understand this is unusual," Finch said, his patience clearly practiced. "But the will is legally binding. The dog, Kaiser, is now your property, along with a trust to provide for his lifetime care." The lawyer gestured back toward his car. "He's with me, in the back." Jake's eyes narrowed, tracking from the man to the car. He could just make out a shape in the rear seat, a dark mass that didn't move. A wave of cold dread, sharp and familiar, washed over him. This was an ambush of a different kind, not with explosives, but with obligation. "No," Jake said. the word a piece of granite. Mr. Carter, Finch pleaded, his professional veneer cracking. Please. The alternative is the county shelter, and given the dog's disposition, they'll put him down within the week. Elias was adamant. He said you were the only one who would understand. Understand what? The question hung in the cold air between them. Understand what it was to be a weapon put back on the shelf? To be full of ghosts? Finch, seeing a crack in the stone, opened the rear door of his car. A low growl, more a vibration than a sound, emanated from within. It was the sound of a storm gathering, of contained violence. And then the dog emerged. It was a German shepherd, but it was a ruin of one. Its black and tan coat was dull, matted in places. A long, puckered scar ran from its shoulder down its flank, a silvery track through the fur. Its ears were alert, but its eyes were what stopped Jake's breath in his chest. They were old eyes, haunted eyes. They held a deep, weary intelligence and a pain so profound it was a physical force. The dog stood its ground, head low, a coiled spring of mistrust and defensive fury. It didn't bark, it just watched Jake, and in that gaze Jake saw it. He saw the reflection, the 1,000-yard stare, the look of a survivor who had seen the abyss and had the abyss stare back. This was no ordinary dog. This was a soldier. Jake stepped off the porch, his boots sinking slightly into the damp soil. He moved slowly, deliberately, hands kept visible at his sides. He didn't approach the dog. He stopped about 15 feet away and knelt, lowering his profile, making himself smaller. The gesture was instinctual, a piece of forgotten training from a different kind of war. The dog's growl subsided, but the tension in its body remained. Its gaze never left Jake's face. His name is Kaiser, Finch whispered, as if afraid to break the spell. Jake ignored him. He spoke to the dog, his voice quiet, stripped of all threat. I see you, soldier, he murmured. The words were for him as much as for the animal. For the first time in years, he felt seen himself. This broken creature, this echo of his own shattered spirit, understood. Mr. Abernathy had been right. He extended a hand, palm down, an offering of peace across the no-man's land of their shared trauma. Kaiser watched the hand, his nostrils flaring, deciphering the scent of courted, grief, and something else. Kinship. After a long, silent minute that stretched into an eternity, the dog took a single, hesitant step forward. The first few days were a silent truce. Kaiser claimed a corner of the main room, by the cold hearth of the fireplace, and watched. He was a shadow that tracked Jake's every move, his eyes glowing faintly in the dim light of the farmhouse. He would not eat if Jake was in the room. He would not drink. He would only accept the bowls of food and water when Jake left them and retreated to the porch, a silent, respectful distance. Jake understood. Trust was not a gift. It was a territory to be earned, inch by painful inch. He moved about his hollow routine, feeling the weight of the dog's stare like a physical pressure. It was a judgment, a constant assessment. He found himself moving with more purpose, his shoulders a little straighter. The simple act of being observed by another living creature was pulling him back from the precipice. He spent hours on the porch, field stripping and cleaning his old service pistol, the familiar, methodical motions a form of meditation. Kaiser would watch from the doorway, a dark sentinel. One afternoon, as Jake was reassembling the slide, a truck rattled up the driveway. It was a new model pickup, jacked up and obnoxious, its engine a roar that violated the quiet sanctity of the valley. A man climbed out. He was fleshy and loud, wearing a camouflage jacket that had never seen a day of actual use. Jake recognized him as Dale Abernathy, Elias's estranged great-nephew, a man known in the small town for his grievances and his cheap beer consumption. Carter, Dale shouted, slamming the truck door. Heard you got the old man's mutt. From the doorway a low growl rumbled. Kaiser had risen to his feet, a silent threat. Jake didn't look at the dog. He kept his eyes on Dale, his hands continuing their slow, deliberate work on the pistol. He's here, Jake said, his voice flat. Yeah, well, that's a problem, Dale said, swaggering forward. That dog is part of the estate, and I'm contesting the will. The whole property, dog included, should have come to me. Family. He spat the word like it was poison. So I'm here to collect my property. Jake slid the magazine into the pistol. The click was unnaturally loud in the still air. He looked up, his eyes as cold and gray as a winter sky. The dog stays, he said. It wasn't a request. Dale laughed, a harsh grating sound. You and what army, freak? I heard all about you. Broken down jarhead living in this dump. You think you scare me? He took a step toward the porch, his eyes on the dog. Come on, you stupid mutt. Get in the truck. He lunged toward the doorway. It happened faster than Dale could process. Kaiser didn't bark. He didn't snap. He moved like black lightning, a blur of contained fury. He didn't bite, but he met Dale's charge with his body, a solid, immovable wall of muscle and bone that sent the larger man stumbling backward, tripping over his own feet, and landing hard in the mud. Before Dale could even get up, Jake was off the porch. He moved with a liquid grace that belied his injuries, covering the distance in 2 strides. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't brandish the weapon. He simply stood over Dale, his shadow falling across him. Get up, Jake said, the command carrying the weight of 100 firefights. Dale scrambled to his feet, mud staining his ridiculous jacket. The bravado had vanished, replaced by a raw primal fear. He had seen the shift in Jake's eyes, the transition from hollowed-out ghost to something ancient and lethal. "You will not come back here," Jake said, his voice a low whisper that was more terrifying than any shout. "You will not speak of the dog. You will not think of the dog. This is his home now. Do you understand me?" Dale could only nod, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Go," Jake commanded. Dale didn't need to be told twice. He scrambled into his truck, fumbled with the keys, and tore back down the driveway, spraying mud in his wake. Jake watched until the truck was gone. He felt the adrenaline, a familiar, unwelcome friend coursing through him. He turned. Kaiser was standing at the edge of the porch, his body still tense, but the growl was gone. He was looking at Jake, and for the first time, the haunted look in his eyes was tempered with something else. A question, a flicker of respect. Jake walked back to the porch and sat down on the top step, his back to the dog. He didn't speak. He just sat there, letting the quiet settle back over the valley. A few minutes later, he felt a tentative pressure against his back. He looked over his shoulder. Kaiser had lain down directly behind him, his body a warm, solid presence. The first inch of territory had been won. The silent partnership solidified. Kaiser began eating in the same room as Jake. He would follow him on his long, aimless walks through the skeletal woods, always a few paces behind, a loyal shadow. One evening, while cleaning a small cut on his hand from a piece of broken fence wire, Jake felt a wet nose nudge his arm. Kaiser looked from the cut to Jake's face, a low whine in his throat. The dog's concern was a strange, warm thing in the cold emptiness of the farmhouse. But the scar on Kaiser's flank and the deep-seated trauma in his eyes were a constant, nagging question. This was more than abuse. This was combat. Jake knew its signature. He ran his hand gently over the dog's coat one night, feeling the familiar landscape of healed wounds. Beneath the fur of Kaiser's left ear, his thumb brushed against something, a slight thickening of the skin. He gently folded the ear back. There, faded but still legible, was a small tattoo. It wasn't a number. It was a symbol, a stylized trident crossed with a lightning bolt. Jake's blood ran cold. He knew that symbol. It was the unofficial insignia of a specialized Black Ops unit that sometimes attached to raider teams. They were ghosts, their missions and even their existence classified at the highest levels. What was a dog doing with that mark? The next morning, he found it. Tucked away in a dusty closet was a box of Elias Abernathy's things that the lawyer had left. Inside, beneath old medals and photographs, was a heavy-duty tactical collar. Attached to it was a small metal disc. It looked like a dog tag. Jake pried it open. It wasn't a tag. It was a small, ruggedized housing for a microchip. He needed help. The name of the local veterinarian came to mind, Dr. Eva Rostova. He'd seen her clinic on his rare trips into town for supplies. It was a long shot, but she was the only expert he knew. He loaded Kaiser into the passenger seat of the old Ford. The dog leaped in without hesitation, a silent affirmation of trust that struck Jake harder than any spoken word. The drive to town was tense. Jake felt exposed, pulled out of his sanctuary and into the bright, noisy world of civilians. Dr. Rostova's clinic was clean and smelled of bleach and antiseptic, a sterile counterpoint to the organic decay of his farm. She was a woman with sharp, intelligent eyes and an air of professional competence that bordered on severe. She looked from the scarred man to the scarred dog, her expression guarded. "He needs a checkup," Jake said, his voice quiet, "and I need you to scan this." He held out the metal disc. Eva raised an eyebrow. "This isn't a standard registration chip." "I know," Jake said. She led them into an examination room. Her movements were efficient as she checked Kaiser over, her initial severity softening as she noted the dog's calm, disciplined demeanor. "He's underweight, but his vitals are strong," she said, her hands gently probing the old scar on his flank. "This wound, this was shrapnel, not a dogfight." Her sharp eyes flicked up to meet Jake's. It was a statement, not a question. "Can you scan the chip?" Jake repeated, his jaw tight. She sighed, then nodded, retrieving a handheld scanner. She pressed it to the disc. The device beeped, then whirred. A string of alphanumeric code appeared on its small screen. Eva frowned. "This is encrypted, heavily. It's not civilian. It's military." She looked up at him, her caution turning to deep suspicion. "Mr. Carter, what is this? Who is this dog?" Before Jake could answer, the scanner, which she had connected to her clinic's computer to run a broader search, emitted a sharp piercing alarm. Red text flashed across her monitor. "Asset detected. Unauthorized location. DOD Protocol 7 initiated." Eva stared at the screen, her face pale. "What have you brought to my clinic?" she whispered. Jake's head snapped toward the front window. His combat senses, dormant for so long, screamed a warning. A black, unmarked van had pulled up across the street. Two men in plain clothes, but with the unmistakable bearing of professionals, got out. They moved with a fluid, predatory purpose that Jake recognized in his own bones. They weren't police. They were hunters. "Lock the door," he commanded, his voice dropping into the calm, lethal tone of a team leader taking contact. "Now." Eva, startled by his sudden transformation, hesitated for a second before scrambling to the front of the clinic and throwing the deadbolt. The click echoed like a gunshot. "Get in the back. Stay down and stay quiet," Jake ordered, his eyes still locked on the men outside. They were separating, one moving to flank the building. An assault. Coordinated and professional. Kaiser was already on his feet, a low, menacing growl vibrating in his chest. He stood beside Jake, his body a rigid line of aggression, his eyes fixed on the same threat. He knew this dance. He'd been here before. "They're here for the dog?" Jake said, more to himself than to Eva, who was crouched behind the reception desk, her face a mask of terror. The pieces were slotting into place with sickening speed. The tattoo, the encrypted chip, the protocol alert. Kaiser wasn't just a retired MWD. He was a classified asset. An asset that had gone missing. And these men were the retrieval team. The front glass of the clinic door shattered inward. It wasn't a gunshot. It was a pry bar, wielded with brutal efficiency. One of the men, a thick-necked brute with dead eyes, stepped through the broken frame. The other was moving around the side of the building, likely heading for a rear entrance. "No one needs to get hurt," the man said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. He held a suppressed pistol, pointed not at Jake, but low toward Kaiser. "Just give us the dog." Jake didn't answer. His mind was a whirlwind of tactical calculations. One threat in front, one flanking. Vet is a civilian liability. Limited cover. Improvised weapons. The clinic became a battle space, the smell of bleach replaced by the electric tang of imminent violence. He took a half step back, drawing the man's focus, placing himself between the intruder and Eva. "Last chance," the man said. Jake's response was not verbal. He kicked a rolling metal stool hard, sending it careening into the intruder's shins. The man grunted, his aim faltering for a split second. It was all Jake needed. He moved like a viper striking. He closed the distance in a blur, his left hand slapping the gun aside as his right hand, fingers rigid in a knife hand strike, slammed into the man's throat. The man choked, a wet, gurgling sound, his eyes wide with shock. Jake didn't stop. He drove his knee into the man's midsection, then brought his elbow down in a brutal arc onto the back of his neck. The man collapsed like a puppet with its strings cut, unconscious before he hit the floor. Silence. Then the sound of breaking glass from the rear of the clinic. The second man was in. "Stay here," Jake snapped at Eva. He turned, moving low and fast toward the back rooms. Kaiser was a black shadow at his heels, moving with a silent, terrifying grace. They flowed together, a two-man, one-dog clearing team. He rounded the corner into the narrow hallway that led to the kennels. The second man was there, halfway down the hall, his weapon up. He was leaner, faster than the first. A wolf, the wolf fired. The suppressor made a sharp thump, and a chip of plaster exploded from the wall next to Jake's head. He ducked back, the sound of the shot echoing the one that had haunted his dreams for years. They were pinned. The man had the only angle. Jake's mind raced. He had no weapon, no cover. The hallway was a kill box. Then Kaiser acted. With a roar that was pure, primal fury, the dog launched himself down the hallway. He wasn't a pet, he was a weapon system. He ran low to the ground, a black missile of teeth and muscle. The wolf, surprised by the sudden, ferocious attack, shifted his aim from the corner to the dog. He fired twice. Thump, thump. The first shot missed. The second grazed Kaiser's shoulder, and the dog yelped, a sharp cry of pain, but he didn't stop. He hit the man's legs with the force of a linebacker, driving him off his feet. The man's head cracked against the concrete floor with a sickening sound. His pistol skittered away into a corner. Kaiser stood over the downed man, his teeth bared, a river of blood trickling down his leg, but he held his ground, a guardian over the fallen foe. Jake rushed forward, his heart hammering in his chest. He knelt beside Kaiser, his hand immediately going to the wound. It was a through and through. Painful, but not critical. "Good boy," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "Good boy, soldier." He secured the second man, using zip ties from a medical supply cabinet. As he worked, he grabbed the man's burner phone, one number in the recent calls. He didn't recognize it. He needed a lifeline to his world, not theirs. He pulled out his own burner, a relic from a past he never thought he'd need again, and dialed a number he had committed to memory, a number he had sworn he would never use. It rang twice. A gruff, familiar voice answered. No greeting, just a single word. "Colonel Marks," Jake said, his voice strained. "It's Carter, Jake Carter." There was a pause on the other end of the line, a silence filled with years of unspoken history. "Carter," Colonel Marks said, his voice sharpening. "You're supposed to be a ghost." "I have a situation, sir," Jake said, the military formality returning as if it had never left. "Contact. 2 hostiles neutralized. Civilian present. I have a compromised asset. DoD origin. They were here for the asset." He looked at Kaiser, who was now licking his wound, his eyes still fixed on Jake. "Describe the asset," Marks commanded. "German Shepherd, male, scar on the left flank. Trident bolt tattoo, left ear." Another longer silence. When Marks spoke again, his voice was grim. "Kaiser, his name is Kaiser." "Yes, sir," Jake said, a cold dread seeping into his bones. "How do you know that?" "Because I was the one who signed his goddamn file," Marks bit out. "He was attached to Task Force 17 on the night of the Al-Masri op. Your op, Carter. The world tilted on its axis, the night his team died. This dog, This dog was there. That's not possible, Jake breathed. There were no canine units with us. Not with you, Marks corrected. With the other element. The deniable unit running parallel. Kaiser was their tracker. He was the only other survivor on the ground besides you, son. The air left Jake's lungs. He wasn't the only one. He wasn't the sole cursed survivor. All this time, this dog, this broken, haunted creature, had carried the same ghosts. Stay put, Carter, Marks ordered, his voice now a steel blade. I'm spinning up a QRF. I'll be there in under an hour. Do not, I repeat, do not let anyone take that dog. He's not just an asset, he's a witness. The line went dead. Jake looked at Eva, who was staring at him, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. He then looked at Kaiser, who nudged his hand, whining softly. A witness. A witness to what? The hour stretched into a lifetime. Jake cleaned and bandaged Kaiser's wound with supplies from the clinic, his movements gentle, precise. Eva, her shock giving way to a grudging respect, brought him sutures and antibiotics. You're a soldier, she stated, her voice quiet. I was, Jake corrected her, his eyes not leaving the dog. And him, she asked, nodding toward Kaiser. Him too, Jake said softly. The wail of sirens grew in the distance, but it wasn't the local police. The sound was wrong, deeper, more menacing. Jake looked out the shattered door. 2 black SUVs, the kind that screamed federal, screeched to a halt in front of the clinic. But before the doors could open, a new sound split the air. Whump whump whump. The rhythmic, percussive beat of helicopter blades. 2 Black Hawks, sleek and predatory, descended from the gray sky, their downdraft kicking up dust and debris. They weren't landing, they were inserting. Ropes dropped, and figures in full tactical gear rappelled down with terrifying speed and efficiency. Marines. Force Recon. A tall, graying man in a flight suit, a colonel's eagle gleaming on his collar, was the last one down. He strode toward the clinic as his men formed a secure perimeter, their weapons covering all angles. It was Colonel Marks. He looked older, more weathered, but his eyes were the same, as sharp and uncompromising as ever. He stopped in the doorway, his gaze taking in the scene. The neutralized men, the terrified vet, and Jake, kneeling on the floor beside a wounded German shepherd. Marks's hard expression softened for a fraction of a second. Report, Marine, he said, his voice cutting through the noise. Jake got to his feet, his body instinctively snapping to a position of parade rest. 2 hostiles engaged and subdued, sir. 1 friendly wounded. He gestured to Kaiser. Civilian secure. Marks nodded, then his eyes fell on Kaiser. He knelt down, his movements slow. Hey, old boy, he said, his voice surprisingly gentle. Remember me? Kaiser, instead of growling, let out a low whine and licked the colonel's outstretched hand. Marks looked up at Jake. Let's get you and the witness somewhere secure. The whole story is a hell of a lot uglier than you think. They were airlifted to a secure military base an hour away. In a sterile briefing room that smelled of stale coffee, the truth finally came out. Colonel Marks laid it all bare, his voice a low, angry monotone. The Al-Masri op wasn't just compromised, he began. It was a setup. Al-Masri was a high-value target, but he was also paying off a man inside the State Department, a man named Henderson, to keep our drones off his back. When we got clearance for a capture-kill mission, Henderson panicked. He couldn't let Al-Masri be taken alive. Jake listened, his hands clenched into fists. Henderson contracted a private military company, Greystone Security, Marks continued, his disgust palpable. The same men you just met. He fed them your team's route and infiltration point. They planted a secondary, much larger IED and made it look like the target's work. They were supposed to eliminate everyone. Your team and the attached Black Ops unit. The room was silent save for the hum of the air conditioning. They almost succeeded, Mark said, his voice dropping. They killed your team. They killed the Black Ops team. But they missed 2, you, thrown clear by the blast, and him. He nodded toward Kaiser, who was lying at Jake's feet, his head on his paws. Kaiser's handler was killed, but the dog was trained to track and hold. He broke free and tracked the Greystone team back to their exfil point. He saw them. He saw their faces as they met with their local contact. He's the only living thing that can tie Henderson's men directly to the scene. Jake stared at the dog, a witness, the sole keeper of the truth of that night. Henderson's people have been trying to clean up their mess ever since, Marks explained. They put out the word that Kaiser was rabid, a danger, needed to be put down. But one of the Black Ops guys, a real old-school spook named Elias Abernathy, had retired to that valley. He heard about the rabid dog, recognized the description, and pulled some old strings. He got to Kaiser before Greystone could and took him home. He hid him in plain sight. Elias Abernathy, the quiet old man on the ridge, not just a veteran, a protector, a guardian angel. Elias knew his health was failing, Mark said. He knew Greystone would come for the dog the second he was gone. He did some digging. Found out a raider, a survivor of the same op, was living right over the hill. He knew you were broken, Carter, but he also knew what you were made of. He bet his life, and Kaiser's, that the Marine inside you wasn't dead. Jake looked down at his hands, at the scars, the calluses. He thought of the emptiness, the ghosts. He looked at Kaiser, who lifted his head and met his gaze. The dog's eyes were still haunted, but they were no longer a mirror of Jake's despair. They were a reflection of his duty. Tears welled in Jake's eyes, hot and sudden, for his team. For the years of guilt he'd carried, believing he was the only one who had failed. For the old man who had placed an impossible faith in a broken soldier. For the dog who had borne the same silent witness. He reached down and buried his face in Kaiser's fur, and a sob, ragged and raw, tore from his chest. The grief he had held back for years finally broke free. Kaiser didn't flinch. He just leaned into him, a warm, solid anchor in the storm. 6 months later, the sun rose over the valley, painting the fields in shades of gold and green. The derelict farmhouse was no longer a tomb. It had a new roof. The windows were replaced, the porch repaired. The fields around it were plowed, neat rows waiting for spring planting. It was a place of becoming, not of ending. Jake Carter stood on the porch, a mug of coffee warming his hands. The scars on his face were still there, but they no longer looked like marks of damage. They were just part of the landscape of a man who had survived a war. The hollowness in his eyes was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady calm. A sharp, clean bark echoed from the barn. A moment later, Kaiser trotted out, a battered tennis ball in his mouth. His coat was thick and glossy, his gait strong. The scar on his flank was a faint silver line, a memory, not a wound. He dropped the ball at Jake's feet and looked up, his tail giving a slow, powerful wag. Jake smiled, a real smile, one that reached his eyes. He bent down and threw the ball, and Kaiser bounded after it with the joyful abandon of a dog who knew he was home. A car, a practical Subaru this time, pulled up the driveway. Dr. Eva Rostova got out, carrying a small bag. She came to the farm once a week now, ostensibly to check on Kaiser, but her visits had become more. She brought supplies, news from town, and a quiet companionship that asked nothing of him. "He looks good," she said, watching Kaiser race across the field. "We're both getting there," Jake replied, his voice even and strong. Henderson was in a federal prison, awaiting trial for treason. Greystone Security had been dissolved, its operators scattered to the winds. The truth of the Al-Masri op had been logged, the honor of Jake's team officially restored. The ghosts hadn't vanished, but they were quieter now. They walked with him not as accusers, but as brothers, their memories a source of strength, not of shame. He had found a new mission. It wasn't about fighting or surviving. It was about living. It was in the feel of the cool morning air, the scent of turned earth, the warmth of the coffee mug in his hands. It was in the steady, loyal presence of the soldier at his side. Elias Abernathy had left him a dog, but he had given him back his life. He had given him a new family, forged in the fires of shared trauma and rebuilt in the quiet peace of a new dawn. Jake looked out at his land, at the dog who was his brother, his witness, his salvation. He was home, and for the first time in a very long time, he was at peace.